Our next two speakers will talk about the history and also a gender issue within the Korean American Catholic experience. First will be Dr. Franklin Rausch. The way I got to know him was that as I was writing about Korean American Catholics, his work would keep coming up and I would keep citing him and I kept saying, who's this Rausch guy? And he knows so much about Koreans. And Dr. Rausch went to school at Indiana and he encountered Korean history and fell in love. So that's the natural way we get to Korea, right? And in studying Korean history, he came across the Korean martyrs and it impacted his life so much. That was the impetus for his personal conversion as well. He teaches history in general, and world history at Niner University, South Carolina. And this semester he's getting to teach Korean history. And you would wonder how many people would be interested in Korean history in South Carolina. Apparently a lot. It's full, actually. And so he's been a great help and person to journey with on this project. His wealth of knowledge. Every time we get together, he's always teaching all of us about our Korean history. And so it's interesting. And he also translates for those who don't speak Korean. So it's an added bonus for us. Dr. Hoon Choi teaches at Bellarmine University in Louisville, Kentucky. He specializes in gender-related ethical issues. He's currently awaiting his first child. And I think it was December 30th, right? December 30th. He'll be busy raising his new family as well as pursuing continuous teaching career. So I'm excited that these two gentlemen get to wrap up the day for us because they have thoughts, directions, and questions for us to ponder when we leave this conference as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. You heard I was a historian. You're still seated, so you haven't left. So I'll do my best not to be too boring. So the purposes here in this presentation, I'm trying to talk to you about what history is. And this is also meant to be a primer for people who might want to work on this project as amateur historians. So I'm actually trying to recruit you. We want to write a history of Korean American Catholics, and we need people. We need people to help us gather data and to help put together that history. So the article that this presentation is based on, that will be in the book, is in a sense both a recruiting tool and a training manual. So I'm going to be talking about some of the principles of history, for one, the purpose of history, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about historical narratives, which are kind of, one thing is important is that when we do history, so it's not boring, is to tell a story. Right? Historical facts, memorizing historical facts without a story is like memorizing a phone book. It's not really useful. And we're also going to talk about some problems in the study of Korean American history and how we can hopefully overcome those. And the last part, I'm going to talk about the actual construction of the history of Korean American Catholicism, the benefits in making this history, against some problems that we may have put together, and possible solutions to those problems. So first of all, we need to define history, right? What is history? One simple definition is history is the study of change over time. Things change, right? The United States today is different from it was in 1975, 1965, and 1955. And so history is sort of, well, how did it change? And causality, why did it change? Why is the world different in 1955 than it was in 1965 or 1975? Or to give an example from Korean history, how is it and why is it that despite being a unified kingdom for hundreds of years, Korea ended up divided into two very different states? Right? That's the kind of question a historian would be possibly interested in answering. And there's a lot of reasons why we study history. One thing that, for me, is just interesting. Right? That's why I like to study. It's fun to get to understand why is it that things are the way they are. To me, that's interesting and fun, and that's good enough. But of course, when I'm teaching gen ed classes to freshmen, I have to come up with other reasons why it's important to study history. One is, though, a big one is it guides our actions. Right? If you want to treat a disease, it helps to know the cause of that disease. If we have a problem in our society, it helps to know why that problem came about. Maybe that way we can help overcome that problem. And so it guides our action. Now, what's key, though, is that how we interpret history can guide our action in different ways. So going back to that question, why did Korea end up divided? If you're someone who answers it by primarily saying, well, it was international factors, it was American and Soviet intervention that ended up dividing Korea, that may affect your politics, right? Because you're going to say, well, wait a second, if Koreas were divided by foreigners, we want to keep foreign influence out of Korea. And if we were divided forcibly, that means that we should be nice to North Korea. Because if we're nice to North Korea, we have a nice dialogue, that will bring us together. Right? So in that case, the saying that this historical division was caused by international factors, that would cause you to support certain politics. For example, you would be more likely to support Kim Dae-jung and his sunshine policy, if you have that view of history. On the other hand, if you said, no, this was we were divided because of domestic factors, because there was an argument about whether our country should be capitalist and democratic or communist. If you view things in terms of domestic factors, then you're going to look at international relations more positively. Right? Well, the Americans are good. They helped stop the communists from taking us over completely. And similarly, you're not going to trust North Korea. You're going to say, those North Koreans, they're the ones that invaded us. They caused lots of problems for us. So there's no need to talk to them. Their government is our enemy, and we need to work to bring that government down. So in that case, the way that you answer that question determines kind of your politics. And it also probably determines your kind of identity to a certain extent as well. Now, what's tricky about this as a historian, historians are always raining on everyone's parade. Someone will ask me a question, I always say, well, it's complicated, and then I give them a 20-minute explanation followed by a bibliography of books they need to read to really understand the issue. Because we like to complicate things, and a historian would say, well, it's actually much more complicated than this. That these factors are engaged in each other, working with each other. And that's the problem that we have, is that we have to look at usually multiple causes, and oftentimes, unfortunately, they don't always translate into nice, easy political answers. Now, the problem is because history is useful in this way, sometimes it can be tempting to be dishonest. And for historians, we have to be honest. We have to try and accurately restore the past, and especially for Catholic historians, right? Because in this case, it's a sin if we criticize someone unfairly or if we praise someone that should be blamed. And I like that. This really shocked me. I show this episode of The Simpsons to my introductory to history course students every year to get them to think about it, because it's a really interesting episode. In this episode, Lisa Simpson is going to do a report on Jebediah Springfield, the man who founded Springfield. She's going to do research on him. And this guy is really big, he's really important. They're going to have this town's bicentennial. He's a great figure who unites the whole town. And Lisa Simpson discovers that, in fact, he was a pirate who tried to kill George Washington. And so she discovers this horrible truth. She has the evidence to show it. She, in the middle of the parade, celebrating him, she stands before everyone and is ready to tell them the truth. And there's a wonderful scene where she looks around at all the people of Springfield. And she looks at veterans holding their flags, and they're very proud. She looks at some elderly people. She looks at some parents with their children. And she sees how Jebediah Springfield brought everyone together. And at the last minute, she just says, he was great. There's nothing wrong with him. And she decides not to tell the truth. Because she saw how this history could unify people. Now, it is true, history could unify people. It gave these people of Springfield a sense of identity that brought them together in many good ways. But the problem with this is it was based on a lie. Right? They said this guy who was a hero isn't really a hero. And the problem I have with this, and the specialty, was even though it would be painful to say that this guy is not actually a hero, it would have been useful. One problem with this guy being the only hero is he's not representative of the community. Right? He's just this white male, or since he's Simpson's yellow male, but they're white. So. but right. And of course, I'm all for white males receiving recognition. But there should be other people getting recognition too. And that was kind of the problem here, was maybe they should have broken this open so other people that were more representative of the community could be included. Now, to show you again how this is important, we can think about the case of North Korea. Right? In North Korea, the understanding of the Korean War, the official understanding, in fact, the explanation given to the North Korean soldiers as they crossed the 38th parallel was they were responding to a southern attack. That's a lie, it's false. It's not, we know for a fact that's false. Soviet archives, for example, confirm that this was a planned invasion by the North. And the problem was, by using this lie, the Kim family was able to say, was able to present Kim Il-sung as the great defender of North Korea. He saved us. The United States, the imperialist United States and the South Korean lackeys attacked us, but Kim Il-sung drove them back. And this then allowed Kim Il-sung to justify the destruction of other communist groups within North Korea. There were communists who were Korean, but they had connections with China, and there were other communists who had connections with the Soviet Union. And the problem was Kim Il-sung used this legend, in a sense, and used his family dominance to crush those factions. And those groups were important because they connected North Korea to the outside world. And when they're gone, that allowed Kim Il-sung to create this cult of personality around himself and around his family, which is oftentimes based on completely false history. In order to justify that regime, North Korea has to be kept isolated. And people always are saying, well, North Korea should reform. It can't reform. As soon as North Korea reforms, the people of North Korea will learn they've been lied to. And the system will come crashing down, and elites may die. So they're not going to let this happen. In a sense, they're trapped by their own lie. The last person I want to be in this world is Kim Jong-un. He's really riding the tiger, you could say. He has to hold on. So we have to be honest. Even though we have the temptation when we do history to make up things, to make ourselves feel better, to feel better about our identities or whatever, we have to be honest, because otherwise we can get trapped in these lies, which won't help things, and which prevent us from coming up with things that can be more beneficial. So, just as kind of review now, so purpose of the history, I think it's interesting. It tells us how we can act to deal with the issues we face. It tells us who we are, and if we have that sense of who we are, that can give us a sense of unity. In addition, history can provide us moral examples that can be inspiring for us. One thing that's kind of one thing I hope we can do together is to help develop the stories of the Korean martyrs in a way that makes sense and inspires people today. Right? Sometimes the hagiography is a little bit stiff, but those are examples of people who inspire us to behave well. But what's key is these all have to be based on fact. Now, we take these facts and we put them into stories. Right? We have to put them into narratives. I can tell you, I teach world history, I teach all this history. People are going to forget 90, 80% of what I've taught them, if I'm lucky. Sometimes they'll forget 100%. Sometimes before the exam, which is really sad. But they usually remember the basic story. They may forget the years, they may forget the names, but they remember the basic story. And that's one thing we want to try and get right, is get a good story, or stories, I should say, about the history of Korean American Catholics. Now, these are a couple of Catholic historians, two Chris's, Christopher Shannon and Christopher Bloom, for Christendom College, wrote this really neat book called The Past is Pilgrimage, and it's trying to talk about how you write a Catholic narrative. And they wrote, we've argued that the historian's craft is most fruitfully understood as the ability to compose historical narratives and other works of history, such as speeches, monuments, and reviews, that exhibit the virtue of right judgment by presenting human actions dramatically within the context of true universal history or master narrative. And what they're saying in simple terms is, we need to tell stories that tell us how we should act, that inspire us to act the right way, that are interesting, and that have as their background this Catholic understanding that we will, we've been bought with the blood of Christ, that Jesus has risen from the dead, and that we will be judged one day based on what we did. And we have to keep that in mind. And one thing I just also want to point out, they said, and other sorts of works of history. And notice that that's not just academics doing history. And that's my invitation, like I said, to all of you, that you can take part in this creation of history. You can do so through composition of music, through artwork, through lots of different things, depending on your own personal talents. Now, what will help us to do this, and this is important, is that we should try our best to think with the church, to be familiar with catechist and so forth, with the catechism of the Catholic Church, and also staying in dialogue with theologians as well. That's one thing that's exciting for me about this presentation, is getting to talk to theologians. Sometimes historians, we're very cynical, and basically we just chart the past, and then when people have hopes, we're like, people try that before, it will fail. So it's nice to talk to theologians and people who believe that good things actually happen. And so it's good for us to be talking to each other. Kind of instead of, historians are cynical. The last optimist historian was Karl Marx. Well, no, he thought good things would eventually happen. The rest is just like, nah. Now, one thing that's kind of funny to me is people will say to me, I want to study history because once I learn it, that's it. It never changes. Because it's in the past. And the problem is this is completely incorrect. It changes all the time. Not because we make stuff up, but because we learn to interpret things in new ways. So this is important. So for example, in the past, a lot of times in Korean history, we focus on the kings. And then a group of people who studied what's called Minjung history said, well, no, we need to focus on the people, not just the kings. Korea's not just a history of kings. And so that caused people to interpret old data in new ways. And also for it to be useful, and history should be useful, if it's going to help us answer the problems we face, it has to be revised. So if you think hypothetically, if you were Korean in 1874, that's 2 years before Japan opened the country by force, you're going to understand Korean history in one day. In 1920, after the failure of the March 1st movement, you're going to face new questions. You're going to understand history in another way. 1945, post-liberation, same issue. 1953, the Korean War has just ended. You're going to read Korean history in a new way. And we're doing the same thing here in 2015. Now, this is also important because the stories we tell keep changing. So for example, if you look at like 19th century narratives about the United States, these are often kind of American Protestant narratives that present American history as the finding of a new kind of Eden, this establishment of a new country where true Christianity, and its Protestant Christianity, would be practiced free from the corruptions of Catholicism. And this was often used to justify anti-Catholic violence, such as the destruction of monasteries or convents and things like that. Now, what happened though, of course, in the 19th century, as you went to the 20th century, you had the Cold War. And that had a fairly friendly view of Catholicism, because the Catholic Church is very anti-communist, and Protestants and Catholics and Jews were able to kind of unite together under this kind of idea of tritheism, where the United States was a country of three faiths. And in this case, Americans, in opposition to atheistic communism, celebrate themselves as religious people. So it's fairly easy to be Catholic in a sense, in that way, intellectually. Now it's a little tricky, and this is where I think a Korean American Catholic narrative could be useful beyond Korean American Catholic circles, is there's a tendency to present narratives of history in which religion is treated in three different ways. One is that it's okay as long as it fulfills kind of a general, vague, progressive agenda. If it somehow contributes to secular ideas of human freedom, it's okay then. It's good then. Or sometimes it's just left out. Or sometimes it's treated as an obstacle. Religion is a source of oppression, it's a source of superstition, irrationality, and therefore it's kind of bad. And that's oftentimes the narrative, either explicitly or implicitly, that we're exposed to, and that we have to kind of think about. So, to give you an example, looking at Margaret Sanger, this is, if you're not familiar with Margaret Sanger, she's the early proponent of artificial contraception. She was one of the people who got that to be legalized, I think, in the United States, and founded an organization that eventually became Planned Parenthood. And so typically in textbooks and monographs about her, she's really lionized in very heroic terms, because she's understood to have contributed to women's rights, freedom of speech, and to have been a champion of progress. And a lot of times in these presentations, then the Catholic Church, which is kind of was one of her main opponents, is presented as kind of superstitious, as irrational, and so forth. And even if you're a fairly devout Catholic and you're hearing this kind of history, you're going to think, geez, our church is often wrong. It's often on the wrong side of history. And this can be kind of depressing and so forth. And this is, though, where it's important for us to include all the data. And this is where it's important for the history of Korean American Catholics to be inserted into broad teachings on American history and Catholic history, because we need more data. So, to give an example, a contemporary, an opponent of Margaret Sanger was this guy, Archbishop Hayes. And he wrote a Christmas greeting, public greeting, in which he talked about developmentally challenged children as angels, as people who had human dignity and had to be treated as such. Margaret Sanger, in response, wrote a pamphlet calling these children defectives who harm society. And so what's happened, we often kind of have this tricky misreading of Margaret Sanger, where she's held up as being about freedom of choice and progress and so forth. Well, a lot of why she supported artificial contraception was to get rid of defective people, to get rid of people who we don't want reproducing. She was a proponent of eugenics, which had this idea that if you want to encourage fit people to have lots of children and discourage unfit people from having children. And that's often left out of the story. And that's what's important for us to kind of consider, is we're often exposed to these narratives that attack our faith, that are critical of faith. And that's fine. We need to be open to criticism, because the Catholic Church is by no means perfect. Catholics are by no means perfect. But at the same time, we have to be open, or we have to acknowledge that sometimes this criticism is unfair. And sometimes it doesn't recognize everything. And oftentimes things like anti-Catholic violence have been forgotten. in these narratives. What time did I start? I apologize. Okay, so, and this leaks into the study of Korean Americans, and this is kind of a concern, an issue I would like us to kind of think about. So give two books that, and I picked these books not because they're bad, I picked these two books because they're good. Right? These are books that are good. One book is called The 1.5 Generation. It's about 10 years ago, and it's looking at 1.5 Korean Americans in Hawaii. And in many ways, it's a really good book. Like, it does a really wonderful job treating these Korean Americans with empathy. It took a lot of work. It's really well done. But the way it deals with religion is interesting. It's hardly mentioned at all, despite the fact that the author recognizes that it's important. The author mentions that she has this directory of Korean organizations in Hawaii, and she notes, I think, like over 70% of organizations are religious. And then she doesn't really say anything else about religion. She spends 20 pages looking at the JCs, which are a group that affirms God in their membership statement, and she never actually deals with the fact that they believe in God. The only time she talks about religion, she spends 2 pages on how Christianity is sexually oppressive. It's like, is that all there is to say about religion's impact on 1.5 generation people that's just a force for oppression? Similarly, in another book, Carrying Across Generations, religion rarely appears. When it does appear, it's when it's benefiting society in kind of a general way. So the example the author gives is praising Korean American Protestant churches for how their pastors help the elderly. And the praise is real and sincere, I think, and it's there. But then in that same section, pastoral activity is presented negatively and is politically charged, and when dealing with sexual issues. And it's interesting again that they focused on sexual issues, which is curious because, I mean, there's a lot more to Christianity than just that. But that's where the criticism arose. And it was very subtle. What kind of disturbed me about it too was that when they quoted people, this had a lot of quotes, they quoted several Korean Americans criticizing their pastor. They never quoted anyone supporting the pastor, and they didn't quote the pastor. And that kind of bothered me. Right? Coming as a historian, I want to try and get all the voices in as much as possible. So this is something I'm hoping, and I'll come back to this momentarily, but looking at Korean American Catholicism can kind of help us deal with it. Right? These are studies that are not dealing rightly with spirituality, right? Where it kind of reduces Christianity to being sexually oppressive. There's a lot more to Christian faith than sexual morality. Now, one thing I have to stress, though, we shouldn't assume negative motives on behalf of people. We don't know these people, right? When someone says something, we don't know what's going on. They may just have a disagreement. They may not be particularly religious themselves. They don't see why it may be important. So we need to assume positive motives unless we see otherwise. And one thing I hope we can do is produce good scholarship that presents authentically Korean American Catholicism, warts and all, we don't want to hide things, that will hopefully correct these problems. Say, hey, we've got to take this seriously. There's more to this than just these issues of sexual ethics. So now, I want to move into another section, talking about making a useful history of Korean American Catholics. First of all, we have to kind of ask who was our audience when we made history. I think we have multiple audiences. One are the Korean American Catholics in the pews. Right? We want a basic history that people who maybe don't care about history can pick up and read or be exposed to through a YouTube video or something like that that will help them in some way. But at the same time, also, I'm hoping we can talk to academics as well. What we're trying to do, in a sense, is part of why I'm here, is trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing and why we're all here. But some things is to help develop faith and identity among Korean American Catholics, to help them deal with issues identified by scholars such as Father Simon Kim, and help them respond to these kind of problematic historical narratives I discussed. In addition, I want to show that the spiritualizing of Korean Americans in general, and Korean American Catholics in particular, are worth taking seriously. And this is also where I wonder if there's this kind of tendency we can somehow connect transnationalism, because it's not like, okay, here's Koreans and here's Korean Americans, and there's no interaction. There's lots of interaction, either through the generations or through going back and forth, through consumption of culture and so forth. And my hope is we can develop multiple deliverable products. So we want books for academics and for anyone else interested, but also, like I say, videos, podcasts, whatever the Korean American community can think of. Comic books would be great. The issues we need to take into account, though, I think, for one, when we talk about Korean American Catholics, we're dealing with a very diverse population. There's massive generational differences, right, between first, 1.5, second, 3, and so forth. There can be cultural differences attached to that. Theological differences, right? People don't always, Catholics don't always agree. And it's interesting that you can have two completely Orthodox Catholics who will get in a big fight at times. And we have to be careful about that. And of course, linguistically, there's issues as well. There's always this kind of struggle with language. As Father Simon has noted, there's problems with competition and factionalism. So my hope is that by developing a strong Korean American Catholic identity through a shared history, that can help with these issues. And I think Korean American Catholics are key to making that happen. Right? I can't write the history of Korean American Catholics on my own. Right? We need help. I am kind of, I'm Catholic, but I'm not Korean. I'm not Korean American either. So when people talk about these issues, I can kind of understand them intellectually. I don't understand them in my gut, on an emotional, experiential level. And that's where I'm saying we need to get people to be amateur historians, and that's why I talked early on, this is what a historian does, so that you can help take part in this process if that's something you would like to do. So one thing I would argue, just as kind of putting down a rough draft of a possible narrative, one thing we have to kind of think, what's the basic thing that Korean Americans have in common? And that's that they are somehow connected to Peninsular Korea. Right? So if we're going to have the argument, we need to first start with the foundation of the Peninsular Korean Catholic Church. We can't avoid that. We can't just start when people get to the United States. I think the second part of that narrative would be tracing the history of pre-1965 Korea to better understand first and 1.5 generation Korean American Catholics. Right? We need to include that. So that, like I said, this isn't hermetically sealed. There's a constant dialogue between Koreans in Korea and Korean Americans in the United States. For example, there's the exchange of priests going back and forth. People go back and forth. Culture goes back and forth. There's a lot going on. Then we would need to also look at the history of Korean American Catholics after 1965. And here, and the fourth part, I think we need to talk about what's going on in Korea today. Because like I said, there's this back and forth. One thing I would argue, though, this history needs to really be a people-centered history. Because I think people remember other people better. We remember stories better when they're about people. And this would not only include martyrs. The martyrs are great, they're wonderful, they're inspiring. We should totally talk a lot about them. But we can't forget that there's lots of, and this is Father Simon was kind of pointing out, there's no Korean saints who are saints for something other than getting killed. And Koreans can do other things other than dying really well. And that needs to be recognized. So for example, Stephen Cardinal Kim Soo-won, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was a very important person who resisted Park Chung-hee's dictatorship and pushed for human rights and so forth. He's a huge hero in Korea. He's someone we can talk about as someone who is kind of a white martyr. And one thing, again, this is where we need Korean Americans in dialogue with each other, is what questions are we trying to answer? Historians are trying to answer questions. I'm still not sure what question we're trying to answer, or what questions. And that's one thing I hope we can determine through our dialogue with each other. Now, 1, 2, and 4 are relatively easy to do, right? 3 is the hard one. Right? 1, 2, and 4 are pretty easy. 3 is hard. So we need sources, right? Historians need sources. We need data, right? Everyone needs data. We can't do something without data. So one thing that I think is we need to start gathering data. Father Alex and Francis Kim very kindly sent me a 20th, or the 10th anniversary, for St. Thomas in Anaheim. They put together a 10th anniversary book. And then they put together a 20th anniversary pamphlet. They sent it to me. And these are things that I think people they just may be sitting on parish bookshelves and like are just ignored. They're awesome. They're so rich. They have poetry. I just think this is fascinating. And short stories. Korean Americans wanted to write, when they thought about their church, they collected short stories and poems. That's something very interesting to me about the community. I don't know what it means, because I have a little trouble understanding Korean poetry. And literature, history is really easy. That's not so But that's something we have to explore, and that's very useful data that we can get together and read and figure out what's going on. Also looking at Korean American Catholic newspapers, the records of Kappa, maybe records in Korea. This is a transnational community in many ways, and I bet there's some really rich things in Korea. It'd be really wonderful to talk to some of the Korean priests and nuns, or Peninsular Korean priests and nuns who went back and forth. And a big thing is oral histories, which I'll come to in a second. The problems we have to deal with, though, who will analyze this information? Who will write it up? And how will we gain access to it, right? We're not all in one place. I'm in Greenwood, South Carolina. The closest Korean American Catholic community is an hour and a half away. I'm not going to be able to do a lot of the research in person. So we have to figure out how we can split this up and then share that information. Now, I'm a big fan, I'm becoming more interested in oral history. I think we can deal with a lot of these problems through oral history. This can help us really fill in the gaps that we face. So for example, Meek Young pointed out in the last last time I asked this question, where are the women? And this is a very big issue. Like we said, there were reasons why this didn't work out in terms of who was presenting, but this is a big issue. And one way we can fill in those gaps that maybe the written records don't have a lot of women in them is we can make sure to interview lots of women. Right? That's how we can deal with this, right? Oral history is the process where we interview people, we talk to them, and find out what their history was and how it interacted with the broader history of this church. And that's something I hope we can do together. I'll talk about in a second before I start doing that. This also, I think, would help build generational unity, right? There's sometimes some big differences between the generations. But if we have second generation people interviewing first generation people and vice versa, that can maybe help them to understand each other. There's some problems with this. It can be very time consuming. It takes time to talk to people. I'll come back to the way I did it shortly, but we would have to train people. There's some legal issues about who owns the interview that I'm looking into. There's, of course, language issues, because, I mean, I can interview someone in English, I can read Korean, I can't interview someone in Korean. I can ask them questions, I'll have no idea what they're saying back to me. And then I'll have to make someone else translate it. It's just, and of course, there's also, sometimes this can bring up uncomfortable histories. We have to figure out how we're going to move forward with that, because this is a fairly new, it's 50th anniversary, that seems like a lot, but for historians, that's a very short amount of time. So some wounds could still be fresh, we have to be very sensitive to that. Now, I started doing some oral history, just to see how this would work. And basically what I did was I interviewed people. I made up a list of questions, and I interviewed 3 people. All 3 of them are here, but I'm not going to embarrass them. But I interviewed one 1.5 person, 2 second generation people, 2 women and 1 man that knows that issue, trying to deal with the gender imbalance. And what I did was I recorded the interviews, I typed up a summary, and then I sent the summary back to the people so that they could then edit it, because sometimes I made mistakes, I misunderstood them. They could add things that they thought should be added, or if they accidentally let something slip that they don't want to be public, they can delete it. And that way that will make them more comfortable interviewing. Now, I've only done 3 of these things, and it took about 2 hours to do an hour interview and then type up the summary and do the shared editing. But so far, it seems to me like a really rich way of developing this and gathering the data we need. One thing, even for the second generation people, the immigrant experience of their parents was extremely important. Like, it really marked them. Even if they weren't alive when it happened, it really marked who they were. And what was really interesting to me was that all of them talked about ways that their faith helped them deal with issues of identity and suffering that they were encountering. And I think in terms of if we want to build unity, like a lot of times I've been hearing Korean Americans, as we converse, talk about this feeling of alienation, that we're separated. Maybe by getting these stories out there and saying, in a book or in some other way that they can read it, and say, well, hey, I feel the same way that person feels. And then that sense of alienation will go down, and you'll have a greater sense of unity. And that's kind of a concrete way we can do this. I don't know, I need to ask the interviewees. I hope it was also helpful to them. Because the idea is I conversed with them. I think I forced them to think about things and to say things. That's a great college one. Say things. Express, that's better, has 2 syllables, not 1. To better express things they otherwise were not expressing. And that's something that I hope was helpful to them. But that's an avenue where we can look at. So as you can see, this is fairly rough. That's why my paper is called Towards the History of Korean-American Catholicism. It's not trying to be a history, it's something that we're still trying to really build. It's still something we're really trying to do. But I hope what I've shown is some of the power of what history can do. History can help overcome some of these issues of alienation, issues of disunion, and help people form this composite identity, synthesis that Drew was talking about in his paper. Like I say, this is a start, and it's something I hope we can continue on. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments and advice on how we do it. I surely look forward to hearing people volunteer to help gather data and find resources. And this is your opportunity to help build this. So I hope that you'll take it. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
I'm going to talk about Korean American Catholic embodiment as a heavenly issue. I mean, as I move along this paper, and I'm dealing with a sort of specific issue. So we talk a lot about the broader issue. I'm dealing with the issue of gender and sexuality from the vantage point of our experience, or Korean American Catholic experience. In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul instructs, I can't see my writing, wow. Okay. letter to the Romans, St. Paul instructs believers to rejoice in hope, which has been one of our themes in our current project, as a sign of improving relations and uniting Christians of different persuasions. St. Paul's conviction is that if we put our trust in God, we'll truly rejoice knowing that our hopes for this unity inevitably will come true. A similar challenge exists for Korean American Catholics today with differing viewpoints of gender and sexuality. I'll refer to Korean American Catholics as CACs, because I say that a lot in this paper. It's mouthful. CAC's views are formed by the general social norms and expectations of gender and sexuality prevalent in American society, the official Roman Catholic teaching and practices, and their own Korean heritage. The result of these multi-layered messages by multiple sources is confusion. In this talk, I'll address some of the sources that contribute to the confusion, suggest ways in which these multi-layered identities can come together to form a new life-giving energy, and extract from this process of identity formation my proposition that this confusion can be transformed into an opportunity for grace. This conversion is possible if cats learn from the multiple personae of the Trinity that they are not in competition but in a balanced movement, a harmonious dance, if you like, among them. Thus, cats can imitate and learn from God's dance. How do we navigate through and harmonize our multiple personae? That is one of the tasks of our current project. For my part, I make this effort from the vantage point of gender and sexuality. If we pay attention to our gender need, we would learn that these multiple embodied identities that make us stay intact are supposed to be noticed, embraced, and celebrated. In the end, by paying attention to their gender selves, cats can discover their multiple identities beyond these gender categories, i.e. Korean, American, Catholic identities, and notice, embrace, and celebrate them. So the American gender expectations. In the interest of time, I will shorten the first few sections of the longer version of this talk, so you suffer less. Suffice to say for now that in a way, Americans are boxed in by some social constructs. While the issues are much more complicated and nuanced, and we can talk about that during question and answer, to generally speak, women are often presented as domestic and passive by the American society. If they deviate, they are either hypersexual or denounced as a threat to the moral order of traditional mothering. For men, there is an assumption of dominance and aggression, or certain acceptance of crude, childish, loud, inept, and unintelligible men, of course, with some exceptions in our time. So we still have, you like Simpsons, right? So we still have Homer Simpson, and we find that as a view of men, and so men are sort of excused or exonerated for their stupidity or childishness, or something similar to that. Moreover, women and men are not stuck in their boxes equally, because to be white in our society is to be normal and beautiful. So our boxed self as men and women we are boxed differently also because of our racial categories. So then we have to talk about Asian American box, not just gender box, but Asian American box. Often the American media portray Asian women as erotic, dangerous, submissive, or asexual, and Asian men, by contrast, as dangerous yellow pearl, stoic and nerdy man, goofy ninja warrior, or performer, or quiet and thus unmanly or effeminate and asexual. So you can think of some of these examples, right? If you look at Lucy Liu, for example, is sort of always seductive. Her roles are very often exotic and erotic. And if you can think of Jackie Chan, sort of the ninja warrior type, right? Or if you can think of Psy, sort of performer, but he's accepted because he's goofy. Oh, there it is, right? So we can talk about all these other examples too. It is inaccurate, however, to claim that American society's portrayal of Asians and Asian Americans unequivocally puts them in the same Asian American box, right? So we have some exceptional cases. For example, how many people are a fan of Fresh Off the Boat, the new show? Okay, good. But I don't know if you caught the episode 2 weeks ago. when the wife was yelling at the husband because the husband was sort of accepted because he was making fun of his own race and own ethnicity. And he was so happy because he was on this morning show, a televised morning show, and he thought he was going to come home and his wife was going to be all happy about how people found him funny and people accepted him. Yet the wife was very angry because he was fitting into this norm that boxes us in this society. So Korean American Catholics are not only boxed by the gender norms of this society, and we're not boxed by just Asian American norms, but we're also boxed in by our received heritage from Korea. While Korean and Korean Americans do not fully identify with each other, they also cannot be fully separated. And Dr. Rausch talked something about that. We can't ignore our Korean heritage. Thus, CACs are direct or indirect recipients of Korean gender constructions. So if you have parents or if you have grandparents who came to this country, the way they raised you and how your parents raised you have some transmission of this kind of constructions. These constructs include 남종여비, which means man is respected and women is lowly, 삼종지조, which means three subordination of women, and 현모양처, which means wise mother and good wife. I can talk more about that if you are interested. It's coming from a Neo-Confucian philosophy. The forces of these received traditional norms notwithstanding, the dominant vehicle for instilling gender ideal in contemporary Korea remains the compulsory military service for men. And I also served in this compulsory service in Korea, so I'm not just criticizing from an outsider. I have an experience with this, and the kind of gender construction and the language that goes on in this realm, I have a lot of precedents. I can't repeat it. The kind of things that they say about women, you would be appalled. What is also, by the way, scary is that I learned that the power of social construction is real and very strong because I came in serving in the Korean military with full conscious of the gender injustice. Yet by the time I was about halfway through, I found myself saying those very same phrases and I was very critical. And I couldn't believe that I was part of the problem. And so that's when I started to realize, wow, this kind of gender construction and social construction is not only real, but it's very powerful. And it takes a tremendous amount of strength to overcome this kind of constructions. I got excited, I just lost my place. A Korean man is not considered 진짜 사나이 or real man unless he has fulfilled his military duties. It is no wonder that many men exercise and promote militaristic ethos and strict gender dimorphism in their workplace, families, and yes, even churches. By the way, all able Korean men, including seminarians, must serve in the military in one capacity or the other. So men continue to control and perpetuate these gender norms in Korea today. In contemporary Korea, these sources of inculcation are manifested in complex and more complicated ways. One of these exhibitions is the way married women are perceived. When people call married women and men 아줌마 or 아저씨, respectively, they perceive men and women in a non-gender sense, but much more so with women. I think a comparable example of this is the African American culture and their phenomenon of nanny. Do you guys know this? How African American culture, very dumb stuff. African American culture has this notion of mothers as nannies, and they're sort of seen as these married women who are generally seen as large and asexual. It's not exactly the same, but something comparable to that is going on in Korean society as well, in my opinion. So Korean American Catholics, there's so many boxes, right? So Korean American Catholics are boxed by these gender norms, but also because of their race and also because of this American society and their received tradition from Korea. But they also have a Catholic box. Gotta be careful, I'm a priest. There we go. The Roman Catholic Church's commitment to human dignity and the life-affirming sensibility through the Catholic social teachings can contribute to enhancing the American and Korean norms about gender and ethnic justice. However, the church must also be self-critical and reflective. One area in which Korean and Korean American Catholic application of gender injustice is maintained is through gender complementarity. This notion, gender complementarity, which was meant to encourage mutual subjugation and sacrifice, mutual, right, husband and wife, mutual sacrifice, is often unbalanced and limiting in practice. Gender complementarity fundamentally claims that all men and women possess qualities and characteristics specific to their sex and are essentially different from one another. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, sort of that kind of stuff. If men and women actively collaborated or complemented between the sexes, both would enhance each other by filling the gender qualities and characteristics that the other gender is lacking. Right? So that's why you're balancing each other by gender traits, or gender complementarity, not complementing, thank you, PLE, complementing. It's not pronunciation, balancing, that's right. I have to check it, I cannot see my pronunciation. As a model, however, gender complementarity may be too simplistic to explain the complex spectrum of gender and sexuality. One of the difficulties that results from this model's biological and ontological destiny is that women as mothers have an irreplaceable role. While the family-first boldness that you see in relation to mothers in church documents is hardly present, although some, hardly present with fathers. I find this to be tremendously important, that the responsibility of the father is not all public, but it also has to be familial. If one can pierce through this box, it may be possible to encourage a model that not only helps men and women to complement each other based on their gender traits, but also, not instead of, but also on the basis of their taste, preference, and talent. Complementing based on their talent, some of which has to do with gender and sexuality, because women have certain experience that men don't have, gestation and pregnancy, all of that, so that they may be conducive to some traits, but the gender norms as defined by the Catholic Church or American society in general, or Korean society for that matter, if it's rigid, then there is this confusion that men and women can go through. In my family, this is quite balanced because I do a lot of things that are traditionally considered women's job, and I enjoy them, and I'm proud of it. An expansive model would not only be in touch with reality, but also be psychologically healthier for all members of the church community. So this is the meat of the talk now, for Korean American Catholics. Rather than be inhibited and impeded by the constraints from external forces, cats can be empowered by their multifaceted identities, the very identities that cradle their anxiety. In other words, the very social, religious, and cultural norms that oppress and suppress cats to become non-beings in our society can be the vehicle through which they can become a new being. But how? How can cats transcend through the very social, religious, and cultural background that often restrict them? What theological concept or concepts allow cats to imagine a life beyond these borders? I suggest that we can all be empowered not only by the doctrine of Imago Dei, that we are created in the image and the likeness of God, but also by the doctrine of Trinity, that God is in relationship, who is multifaceted in one harmonious essence, and who created us in that image. In other words, Imago Trinitatis. That is, cats have the distinctive opportunity to embrace their multi-layered and authentic selves, to realize that those aspects of the self are gifts from and of God, and to welcome and encourage others to embrace their multiple dimensions of their equally authentic identities. Beyond the distraction and social constructions, then, cats must discover the spark. Thomas Merton talks about it. Cats must discover the spark from the triune God that dances in the depth of our being, and notice, embrace, and celebrate it as a gift, free gift. grace from God. That is, we learn from the divine dance of the Trinity, which, unlike Arian subordinationism, highlights the co-inherence of the three divine persons that inhere in one another and draw from one another. In this divine dance, there are neither leader nor followers, only an eternal movement of reciprocal giving and receiving, and giving again and receiving again. This model of the divine dance can not only support a vision of egalitarian human community, human relationships, but also sustain an appreciative vision of different identities coexisting in the self. For cats, then, the task is to imitate what this Trinity does and learn to dance harmoniously among the different layers of their identity so that they notice, embrace, and celebrate who they are authentically and integrally. For cat girls and women, therefore, I'm going to talk about women first because when you write, scholars just talk about men first. For cat girls and women, therefore, here's I know. It means that it's little things. It means that they must struggle to pierce through the woman box with an ethnic, cultural, and religious weight on top of it, and do so by discovering their God-given grace and dignity, advocating and fully embracing one's imago Dei can counter the part of our socio-religious culture that denigrate women as solely domestic sexual objects and dangerous and doubly so for Korean Asian women as they are seen as submissive, exotic, erotic, or cunning. However, one should not do so by dismissing or disowning their ethnic, cultural, religious heritage. While their heritage is not perfect, as no simple human reality is, cat women can arise out of sin and be resurrected into a new being in the very context from which their sins came, the Korean American Catholic context. Embracing the goodness and gifts of their tradition, cat women can dance again, emulating the Trinitarian dance among the three persons of Trinity by noticing, embracing, and celebrating their Korean American and Catholic gifts. This is a way to fully accept God's grace and God that made all women in the Trinitarian God's image. Imagine, for example, our socio-religious cultural institutions upholding and celebrating the full value and dignity of women. Such a celebration would bring a world of difference to a young cat girl who excels in school. Rather than seeing her as a threat, a nerd, or model minority, or unwomanly, her gifts would be praised, admired, celebrated, encouraged. Imagine a female cat youth from a poor family with a beautiful single eyelid and darker complexion who aspires to be an accountant, a soccer player, an engineer. Imagine when instead of institutions seeing her as asexual or dangerous or telling her she must be more exotic, sexy, and submissive to succeed, sometimes even to the point of telling her to get a plastic surgery or not to pursue her dreams, she is told that her talents, her family are all gifts of and from God to flourish in and to be shared with God's human and non-human communities. Imagine a middle-aged cat woman who has bilingual, bicultural, organizational, and sharp observational skills. Imagine if instead of telling her that there's no place for her, an ajumma, in the church parish council, and at most she can serve as the head of the mothers group in charge of the kitchen, or CCD, education-related positions, that she is told that she is a being with full dignity and her insights and skills are exactly what is needed in the leadership positions in the church to address and contest the falling number of church membership within Catholic churches and the wider church. Imagine telling a Catholic wife whose husband is admired in their Catholic community for going beyond his masculine borders by working full-time and still managing to do the dishes and laundry, some cooking and cleaning, while also taking care of their children, that we have failed to acknowledge the fact that she has already been doing all of that for years without proper recognition and gratitude, because it is naturally expected for a proper mother to sacrifice. Imagine an elderly CAC female member in the church who has seen the world change during her lifetime. If instead of simply giving her rides and lip services and occasionally asking for help in the kitchen, the church gave her a voice so that the community could listen and learn from her wisdom resulting from her experience. Imagine telling her that she is a living memory of the CAC church. Imagine all the possibilities for CAC's growth, not only in the size of the membership, but also personally, communally, and spiritually. All this is made impossible often because of assumptions about CAC women's gender expectations that limit CAC women's full flourishing resulting from the social, religious, and cultural role assignments according to their sex. For CAC men and boys, therefore, it means that they too must struggle to break through the man box with the ethnic, cultural, and religious weight pressing down on it, and do so by discovering their God-given grace and dignity. This discovery is impossible if CAC men are stuck in their boxes and give in to socio-culturally and religiously constructed version of men by solely being aggressive, childish, stoic, and dominant. If we sit back and let American cultural norms or other cultural norms dominate those in the margins, CACs will always be seen as nerdy, goofy, unmanly, asexual, and possibly unattractive. However, trying to break free from these constraints through hypermasculine reaction, which is often the case, or becoming Caucasian, only solidifies the bamboo ceiling, and CACs who do so will never be considered a real men or real Americans. Again, while Korean, American, and Catholic cultures can be constraints, the problems from these forces pale in comparison to the goodness found in these traditions. So then how can CAC men dance? And yes, it is okay for men to dance, and actually it's healthy. The Trinitarian dance and notice, embrace, and celebrate their Korean, American, and Catholic gifts. The first task is to recognize that they are trapped in these invisible boxes. That means that CAC men must realize that CAC boys become boys every time their parents dress them in blue, excessively differentiate them from girls, gave them military or sports toys, or told them that boys don't cry. By the way, I'm expecting a boy. This hits home so hard. But I noticed this power of social construction is so strong because I do consciously, and I will make my best effort consciously to raise my kid without these kind of constraints. But already I'm getting gifts from my parents, from the in-laws, from my friends that are so gender specific that even if I try, people around me won't let me. So I'm getting all these trains and. So CAC men must also recognize that they are not asexual or unmanly because some of them do not wear clothes worn by the dominant culture, or because they are interested in wearing colorful clothes, or like to listen to K-pop or Korean pop music, or watch Korean drama. Moreover, the pressure to become more aggressive and score a leadership position within the church council is simultaneously a result, in part, of gender socialization and a contributing factor in perpetuating unjust, unhealthy notions of masculinity. In terms of CAC churches then, rather than saying that Catholic Christian liturgies, confessions, or spirituality are too feminine, and hence they must be masculinized to grow the church's male membership by holding more golf tournaments and involve more alcohol in the church's regional gathering, a lot of for example, CAC men must promote healthier and indeed more Christian approaches to the inner and outer growth of their communities. Imagine, for example, our social, religious, and cultural institutions telling CAC men that they do not have to become someone else to be accepted and loved, rather that they are already lovable and are a gift to this society and of God. Such an acknowledgement and encouragement would make a world of difference to a young cat boy who excels in non-aggressive activities or shows talent in humanities or in the arts, God forbid theology. That's my pitch. Rather than seeing him as unmanly or asexual or weak, his gift would be praised, admired, and encouraged. Just imagine a male cat youth who listens to hip-hop music, plays classical instrument, or enjoys reading, when instead of our institution telling him that he has to listen to mainstream music, watch and play football, or become more aggressive to fit in, he is told that he is already lovable and a gift of and from God. Imagine a college-aged cat man. If instead of being told that he has to be childish or make fun of his own ethnicity and will conquer white women or non-Asian girls, he is told that he does not have to compromise who he is or where he came from to be genuinely masculine, and that his talent and his honest perspective from social, religious, racial, cultural oppression is exactly what is needed to make our planet a better place. I have some experience with this because in high school and in college I did make fun of my own ethnicity, and I bleached myself, if you will, and I was rewarded. Everything I applied for, people accepted me, and so because the rewards are so great, the temptation was there, and so I became Twinkie. I became light. So I gave in too. I thought that was key to success until I realized that there is a bamboo ceiling and that I was just a token Asian rather than them accepting me as who I was. That's when I started to say, oh, this is not the right path. Imagine a recent male cat graduate facing an uncertain job market who, rather than being told he must not show emotions or any signs of fear or admit his anxiety, he is told that everyone in his shoes is scared about future uncertainties, fears failure, and can benefit from acknowledging and talking about such anxieties with his loved ones. Imagine telling him that spirituality and needing religious healing is not a sign of weakness, and this culture certainly has this, but an acknowledgement of human sinfulness, frailty, and restlessness that often leads to a sounder awareness of his authentic self and more peaceful heart. So religious healing is something that men can also strive for. And I say this because whenever in college when I do religious things, women outnumbered by men exponentially. I liked it at the time. But reflecting on it afterwards, I noticed that there's something wrong. The culture is telling that religion, to be religious, to be Catholic, is not men. Imagine telling a middle-aged cat man, because of religious services, you have to cry. That's not tolerable. Imagine telling a middle-aged cat man that he did not fail because he did not become a CEO or did not get a promotion or was not elected a president of his church's parish council, but rather that his success is measured by how loving, caring, and responsible he was to his family, his surrounding environment, and indeed the least of God's people. Imagine telling a cat priest that he is not admired for his manliness, that is characterized by non-compromising, hierarchical, or sometimes neo-Confucian attitudes, sometimes childish authoritativeness, but for his ability to contextualize his ministry, nurturing a community atmosphere of an open dialogue and ushering in a loving ethos, even at the risk of being seen as unmanly by the society at large. Now, I'm not speaking about all three, so I'm just talking about select few. Imagine telling an elderly cat man that he is not a toothless or clawless tiger, this is a Korean expression, but an important contributing member and a living memory of his community. Imagine If we enable Cat women and men to roam and dance freely through their God-given multi-layered identities, it would help them transcend many obstacles that confine them to their boxes. If we cannot imagine it, we will remain in our boxes, telling ourselves that this box is not so bad, that this situation is fair, and ultimately convince ourselves that there are no boxes. If we cannot imagine it, our chances to notice, embrace, celebrate our multi-layered, dignified self will never become a reality. However, if we are just stuck imagining, it simply becomes a fantasy. A full embracing of human dignity must be carried out on the most basic and practical level, in all Cat communities and beyond. If God is a dancing trinity in celebration, God must also want us to dance with God. For cats to do so, the leaders of religious institutions and families must help young Cat women and men overcome some obstacles. Their labeling of emotion, conversation, and cooperation as not masculine, or of rational activity, or rational, active, and authoritative quality as not feminine or Asian. Simultaneously, however, we must encourage them to lead from what we have been labeled as strictly masculine and feminine values: rationality, intelligence, ambition, and poignancy, empathy, and care. All these characteristics can be, regardless of color, gender, or religion, vehicles through which the grace of God can be made more visible in our lives. Restricting them would not only be individually and institutionally detrimental, but also limiting their God-given human capacity to live more fully, authentically, more honestly, and more fully. After all, St. Irenaeus taught us, Gloria Dei est videns homo. The glory of God is when human beings are alive, or fully alive. So here's my conclusion. The struggle remains. It was difficult to find, for example, female contributors to our project. And when we did find some, there was no interest, or at least no expressed interest to join our project at hand. And of course, unfortunately, we had a female member who, for personal reasons, had to drop from the project. Thus, this talk serves not only as a critique of society and culture, but also, perhaps more importantly for us, a stark reminder of the need for introspection. Looking within. What can cats do to bring about conditions that allow men and women to live more fully as Korean American Catholics? This task still remains. It's the condition that's not allowing female members to join. We ask, and they say, hey. One way to initiate our step toward the right direction, right Catholic direction, is to pay attention to Jesus, the Nazarene, who crossed his border with his multiple identities. Jesus did not just take charge with his 12 disciples, but with a number of named and unnamed women. He nurtured and wept for the oppressed. He was a celibate whose father was not his biological father and probably didn't have a Y chromosome. He was unmanly by his social norms, and he helped people who were considered unmanly, therefore unworthy in his time. Indeed, he would be considered abnormal by our norms today. He would be an ostracized Korean American Catholic, like many of us today. However, he led from the harmonious dance of his diverse self. He did not stop celebrating. He was empowered by his multiplicity, and he owned it. As a result, the person of Jesus himself became not confusion among many identities, but a unifying grace for others to see and learn. Is this not the task of all cats? Cat Church must make visible the fullness of who we are, especially in young cats. The social, religious, and cultural institutions which often distort what is and confuse many of us can become foundations for grace. When we are empowered by Korean, American, and Catholic tradition and own them through our struggles and dances, it would unify all of us by revealing the image of God in us. By noticing, embracing, and celebrating our true selves, we we can live a life full of joy, responsibility, and selfless love that is inclined toward the service of others, especially the ones in the most need. In this way, cats can become an important contributing part of a wider Christian body and certainly a participating member of the mystical body. Jesus' story had been preaching this message to his disciples and therefore to all of us all along. Our bodies and our very being have been telling us this all along. We are simply not aware because we are often blinded by limiting social, familial, and indeed religious constructions. When God's creation is living to their fullest selves, when we truly humanize each other to our fullest potential, we will truly make God visible, present, and alive in our lives. What cats and all of us need to do, to borrow Pope Francis' term when he was visiting Korea, is to wake up. Now wake up. When we're awake, when we realize that God's message is being told through us, when we finally love ourselves, when we truly rejoice in hope. When we are awake and when the relationship among our multiple identities are in harmonious flow, we'll begin to see that Imago Trinitatis, extends to a harmonious relationship among all cat communities and indeed all of human communities as one body with many parts. Let us notice the goodness, then, in all of ourselves. Let us love our Korean, American, and Catholic selves. Let us learn from our triune God and rejoice. And let us dance.
Thank you, Franklin and Hoon, for that wonderful presentation. Many things to talk about. So if there have any questions right now that you would like to raise to these two presenters?
I have just a general comment, not so much questions. Recently I moved to a new parish in Irvine, we call Irvine. It's upper middle class, one of the safest cities in the country. 4,300 families, used to be predominantly white, and now Asian population is over 50%, and so it's very multicultural kind of a setting. I'm the third pastor there, but I'm the first Asian American pastor there. My associate is Vietnamese American as well. He's new to the parish. So, but I recently received an email from a parishioner implying that my Koreanness is a problem, okay, as a pastor. So, of course, I was very angry to receive that email. But then yesterday I received another email from another parishioner saying that she identified herself, I don't know who she is, that parishioner, as Indian. She sounded Indian American. So she was very happy with the fact that I'm an Asian American, right? Korean American. So my point is that, I don't want other people defining who I am. The Koreanness is very important to me. Being Korean, American, Catholic, all those three parts are very important to me. And I don't want other people defining who I am for myself. And I think for our community as well, and I'm glad that we're doing this because this is how we try to discover the deeper meaning of who we are as a Korean American Catholic. And of course, all the presentations were very, very helpful. And when I was seeing the different presenters, I was thinking that this is what it means to be a Korean American Catholic. That we're trying our best to tell our story and reflect on our own identity, our own history. And we can only do this in the present moment. And we're not going to discover who we are 20 years later suddenly, But I think we're doing that right now, and this is the best we can do with what we have. And so I really appreciated all of the presenters, but also all the people who are here too, because all of you, whether you're Korean or non-Korean, really doesn't matter. We're telling our story to each each other. And this is what it means to be a Korean American Catholic, and all of us play a very important part in it. So I want to just thank you everybody for great effort and your contribution.
Thank you. Maybe I should piggyback on that and bring up a question or a thought that I had throughout the day is, and we heard it in different contexts. One was for the ownership or the next generation to take ownership, and then we hear when you talk about a rise or a wake up, and there's a sense of urgency that seems to be there, but there's also a sense of complacency. And the question I have is, how do we move this forward? How do we wake people up? How do we stir the pot and say, we got to start talking about this, or we got to get the young people more active, or how, these are the boxes that are trapping us in. How do you get people to say, oh, that's nice, but that's life, deal with it. So how do we get that reaction from people that we want?
I think that we have to make the condition for the possibility of people wanting to be excited. So one of the problems that I see is that we can talk about that God is love and nice and warm and fuzzy, but that we start doing very intentionally that this church community or this society, this Korean American Catholic Theologian Society, intentionally advertise and show that we are an inviting community. I personally, that's my take. I see many young people, including many of my friends, who doesn't have that kind of excitement for their church anymore in any sense, because they don't feel like the church is very inviting. So then we have to make intentional effort to, if Catholics are infamous notorious for not welcoming in new members. Do we agree on that? We're notorious. So instead of saying we have to do better with that, we have intentionally assigned someone who purposely their job is to welcome people and be inviting. Don't talk about gender justice without having men go into the kitchen and do the work with women. It's not easier for women to do this job. So very intentionally, we start doing these little things, and I think those little things will add up to a kind of an atmosphere where the church seems more welcoming. The theology is very welcoming, I think. There's no doubt about that. But it's just that how we appropriate that is important, and I think we can start with these kind of things.
Just out of curiosity, from what I've noticed with a lot of different Korean churches, amongst Catholics anyway, is that even though it is a Korean American church it's a Korean church in America, it tends to follow more traditional Korean values, where it's very hierarchical, it's more based on generational, as far as, the older generation tends to be the leadership, where the younger tends to be more subservient. How do you feel like that sort of, given that environment and being that that Korean American tends to be kind of walking that blurred line of being neither truly Korean and also neither being truly American. And you feel like that kind of kind of skews a little bit of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
Okay.
I agree with you. And that's one of the reasons why we're kind of coming together, because many of the Korean American Catholic churches are in fact Korean Catholic churches.
Right.
From our perspective, right? From our young generation, our lived experiences, that when we go to, and there are exceptional churches, and there are churches that does a wonderful job of accommodating and being hospitable. Even though we're hospitable, it's saying that the Korean Catholics are sort of the owners and they're being hospitable to Korean Americans. And so these languages, something we need to work on too. But there are wonderful churches that does this really well. And I know I talked to Father Pio and what they do in their kitchens, and I talked about that. I'm so encouraged by that and their ministry for English-speaking communities. And so there are churches that does this well, but many of them don't. And many of the churches are run by priests who come from Korea. So then through Kappa or maybe the training exercises may be more intentional about these kind of issues that may help. I don't have all the answers, but there's one suggestion.
No, I mean, because it seems like a very obvious diagnosis, right? Because in the sense of, I know some churches where, running a very traditional sense of, no, you do what we tell you to do, regardless of whether you have your creative, you want to do something new. And then they wonder, where did everyone go? As they're running folks out, then they wonder, why are there no children here? Why are there no young, where's there no youth? So, I don't know, I mean, I guess that's, my cousin, he's Protestant, what he and his wife did, went to a church founded by Korean American pastors and kind of where they cater very more specifically to a Korean American need. Not saying that it's necessarily the right answer, but that community seemed to be very happy. But then there was a rift there, and then they started another church. So, I'm just, in the sense of, obviously running away is not the answer.
And I also want to make sure that I don't come across saying that the blame is all on the church.
Absolutely.
It's the culture also. American culture is very secularized right now. And we are living in the secular age, and that certainly contributes to the diminishing number of members. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
Kevin, you have a question?
Well, this is in response to Dr. Choi, but this is open to anybody who has insight on it. But the question is about spirituality and discipleship. So one thing I'm hearing Dr. Choi talk about with these boxes is that sociologically we have who we say we are, and then we have who others say we are, right? These two things are constantly in tension. I don't have that discussion before. So what I'm wondering is, there any resources for spirituality or discipleship then to kind of navigate outside those boxes? Does that question make sense?
Yes, it does. For me, and I'm biased, and let me be upfront about that. I'm biased, and I now live and teach in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I'm in this town full of Martin spirit. And I've been reading about Martin a little bit. And I think Martin's spiritual writings helps tremendously to encourage the discovery of the true self that he talks about, but he also talks about the false self, right? And so, and when I said the spark, that's his language, he thinks that there's a spark in all of us, whether you want to call it, the secular language, you call it goodness, right? Or we call it grace or human dignity, whatever you want to call that spark, we all have it, right? And so that encourages us to look within and discover our true self, rather than society telling us what we're supposed to be. He's more eloquent than I am, the way I'm presenting him. But that kind of spirituality is certainly Catholic, and I think that is immensely helpful. I encourage everybody to read the Conjectures of the Guilty Bystander, even more so than the Second Struggle. It's my personal opinion.
Perhaps a final question, if anyone has what they would like to ask.
Going back, what I don't know your name. Dave. I think we are talking about Korean American church here, but there's two cultures also in Korean American. One is Korean, one is Korean American, and probably the young people will be Korean American, and probably your parents and new immigrant will be Korean. So I think, and also the problem with the priests trained here and priests bringing them from Korea. I think the priests who come from Korea, they are trained in seminary, not in Confucianism Korean, but they are trained as a military background. So it comes from, okay, I am your senior, you do whatever I tell you to do. Even though you are younger, or I'm saying older than I am, he said, okay, you're going to do whatever I want. I think that is some problem with the church here in US with the Korean. Because there are so many layers of different culture there. You cannot say it's a Korean American, yeah, but it is a probably 7 or 8 layers of different theologies. So how we want to overcome? So I think that is our work to do, doing together.
But the Father Apostle who presided at my wedding, and I didn't know it was coming. It's all part of his divine plan.
I think that was a great way you summarized the complexity of our community. There's so many layers, generationally, culturally as well. And I want to thank everyone for coming today. This was a wonderful event, not just for us being here, but I think in the historical memory of our community. And I think historical memory is very important. You know, we won't realize what we've done today or in this project or what we'll do until people will come after us reflecting on what we've done. And these are the little steps we take to building an identity and narrative and so forth. So I'm very blessed to be here and to the speakers and to walk with you guys for 3 years and see you develop your papers, and it's been a true blessing to me as well. And I just want to thank once again Dr. Kavanaugh and the Center for World Catholicism, because they have been truly a blessing to me this semester. I think a lot of this wouldn't have come together without being invited here, and also your openness to host such an event on a Saturday, which you guys normally don't work. So we're very grateful. And I just want to give 2 plugs. One is if your children or if you're thinking that you want to pursue theology or Catholic studies, this is a wonderful place. Dr. Kavanaugh is a wonderful professor to be mentored by. You can't find anyone better. And if you're, want to pursue further studies, Bob Schreider over at CTU, they have a wonderful program as well. And they have many Korean candidates, but they have yet to have a Korean American candidate, I believe. So it's not only do we need women, but we also need generational theologians as well. And so it's something that we have to nurture and ask you to consider as well. And we have 2 wonderful opportunities as well.
We do have a Korean American candidate right back there.
And there's another person, Phil Yang. He's with the Augustinians. He's also part of the student.
Yeah, I taught Phil Yang in Sunday school at St. Thomas before I went to seminary. Makes me feel old.
The only thing I wanted to do was, I didn't want to pass up this one opportunity to use the only phrase in Korean that I know, which is 감사합니다. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for the gifts that this whole community brings to the church, and thank you for the presenters and the audience for the gifts that you brought to us, both the church and the academy today. So, thank you.